So recall in the last video that we performed, or we went through fertilization, and while all those events were happening, don't forget that that oocyte or ovum, that even with the sperm, as it penetrates and it enters, and we went through those steps of fertilization, that oocyte or that egg is still traveling down the uterine tube towards the uterus. So it's continuing to travel as we're going through all of those previous steps of fertilization and half of these steps here that we're going to go through now. So this is zygote to blastocyst, and the two significant events that happen in this process are here. So first, there's something called cleavage. So that zygote is going to go through mitosis rapidly many times. So you're going to get a whole bunch of cells. They're going through mitosis. The zygote is dividing and dividing again and dividing again. So we get these multiplication of cells very quickly. And that does not allow those cells to grow very much before they divide. So you have a lot of cells in a small little space, which means you have a lot of surface area compared to the volume. And that allows nutrients to diffuse into that zygote that's becoming a blastocyst, nourishing all those cells. Second step is implantation of the blastocyst. So once we've created our blastocyst through those mitotic divisions, that blastocyst will implant into the inner lining of the uterus after about 6 or 7 days after that egg was first ovulated. So we're going to look at these steps in some more detail. So during cleavage, well, let's just start with ovulation. Enters the uterine tube. There's our oocyte or the egg. Fertilization happens. That was last video. And then we get cleavage, our first step here in this video. So cleavage, we can see that zygote that formed becomes 2 cells, becomes 4 cells as it's traveling, and it just keeps dividing until we get this solid ball of cells. It's not hollow. It's dense. It's a solid ball of cells. That's called the morula. And that's after 3 days after fertilization. And you can see this morula continues to move, and then we start getting this cavity right here. It's called a blastocyst cavity filled with fluid. So that's the early blastocyst of the hollowed out morula. We could see that there. And then, well, we call these cells on the perimeter trophoblast cells. There's the blastocyst cavity. These cells here that are clumped together, we call the embryoblast. So this blastocyst, this entire thing here, is what is going to implant into the wall of the uterus in the next step. So here is our blastocyst. There's the wall of the uterus, or uterine wall. We see it's day 4. We're not quite a week yet, so it has not implanted yet. By the way, this slide is on implantation. So it's day 4, and it still has, remember the zona pellucida that the sperm broke through? It still has a zona pellucida, but by day 6, it's gone. And it says it hatches, I guess, because we call this an egg sometimes, but it hatches, and the blastocyst is now free from that zona pellucida, like we see here at day 6, so it's ready to implant beginning around day 6 or 7. So the blastocyst itself consists of about 100 cells. It's fluid-filled, and it's this hollow sphere that's filled with fluid, but there's 2 actual types of cells at this point. We got the trophoblast cells, which is the entire sphere, which we see in orange. They participate in placenta formation, or chorion. So these cells, which become chorion and become the placenta later on, are these trophoblast cells, and they're also going to be important to implant the blastocyst into the uterine wall. The other cells that we see here in blue, the embryoblast cells, some of them will become the embryo, and extra embryonic membranes. So we'll go through those a little later on. So all those extra embryonic membranes, except for the chorion, which becomes the placenta, will come from the embryoblast cells. So there's in day 7 we see the trophoblasts invading the uterine wall and start entering into the uterine wall. So now fast forward to day 9, and you see this continued implantation into the uterine wall, into day 11, and what we can see, which is new in day 11 here, is look at the lining of the uterine wall, this epithelium, the simple columnar epithelium. It starts to reform, completely enclosing the blastocyst inside the uterine wall. So there's a small period of time where the uterine wall is receptive for implantation. And in cases where implantation fails to occur, the uterus becomes non-receptive again and will not allow the zygote to implant. And here it says 2/3, so the majority, 2/3 of all zygotes form to fail or fail to implant by the end of the first week, or they spontaneously abort. Of course, this number is hard to determine for accuracy because most of the time individuals don't know this is happening. Only when someone's actually being monitored, maybe in a fertility study, that they can measure this, but this really isn't something normally that people are aware of. And then an estimated of 30% of implanted embryos, so only 1/3 implant. So of those that implant, only about 30% miscarry. And most of these miscarries are unknown as well, just because everything's so small at that point. Only 10 to 15% of miscarries are known pregnancies. The rest are not known yet. It would just seem like a normal menstrual cycle if someone has no idea that they're pregnant. And usually it's due to genetic defects of the specific embryo, or of the specific embryo, where it would never have been viable in the first place. So it's not anyone's fault. It's just the sperm, the egg that came together, and those chromosomes happen to have some genetic defect which would not allow it to be viable. There could be other reasons: uterine malformation, a number of unknown problems, but most miscarries will occur in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. The term miscarriage is used up to 20 weeks. After 20 weeks, it's called a stillbirth. So, implantation is usually completed 12 days after ovulation. Remember, ovulation typically happens at day 14 of the cycle, so 12 plus 14, that's the 26th day of the cycle. That's about the same time menstruation would occur. So implantation or menstruation happens at the same time, just depending on whether there's implantation or not, or fertilization or not. Now, recall the corpus luteum that's inside the ovary, which released the egg to begin with. That needs to be maintained, because without the corpus luteum, then we'd have, or female would have, menstruation. So the corpus luteum is maintained by a hormone called the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, and that prevents menstruation, because HCG, and by the way, that's secreted by, remember those a slide ago or 2 slides ago, the trophoblast cells, which later become the chorion, secretes HCG, and HCG maintains the corpus luteum. Without HCG, the corpus luteum would degenerate, and therefore there would be no more progesterone and estrogen secretion. And that's what the corpus luteum secretes, which we learned last chapter. So without those hormones secreted at high levels, well, then the uterine lining is shed. And of course, we don't want that if there is implantation. So implantation occurs, trophoblast cells secrete HCG, HCG maintains the corpus luteum, therefore progesterone and estrogen continue to be secreted at high levels to maintain the pregnancy. Or in other words, keep the wall of the uterus thick to facilitate the correct environment for the embryonic stage of the pregnancy. HCG also helps prevent the mother's immune system from attacking. So this new embryo, or blastocyst, we can call it at that point, is foreign. It's something new, and of course that immune system is designed to attack whatever is foreign. So that immune system suppression by HCG allows that blastocyst to persist. So this is why the 14 days after ovulation of the cycle is very important and is very tightly regulated at 14 days, is because we don't want menstruation to occur if there is implantation. So after 14 days, if there's no implantation, that means, well, we cannot maintain that pregnancy at that point, and menstruation would occur. And that's why we have that 12-day implantation before that 14-day cycle. So it's either or, right? It's either menstruation or HCG maintaining the uterine lining. So here we see gestation weeks, and this is what I was talking about in the last video, which is different than ovulation or the actual age of the embryo, because there's ovulation, and that's 2 weeks after 0 here. That's because 0 is the first day of the last menstrual of menstruation, first day of the last menstrual cycle. So that's where they begin gestation weeks. So ovulation and fertilization doesn't ever actually happen until about 2 weeks later. So the point here is, and this is weeks, not days, right? So once HCG is being secreted by those trophoblast cells, we see that big spike in HCG. So a female does not have HCG in their system unless they're pregnant. So HCG levels are detectable in the mother's blood within 2 days after implantation, somewhere in this period right here. So that's why it's used for all pregnancy tests, because someone who has just recently become pregnant will have high levels of HCG in their blood. And then after about 2 months, the placenta takes over for the corpus luteum. Once the placenta develops, so right about 2 months, right here at 8 weeks, the placenta begins to secrete progesterone and estrogen like we see right there. So the corpus luteum isn't needed anymore, and therefore that HCG can start to decline because the placenta is taking over. Now, it's kind of interesting point here is someone who's in their 3rd trimester could take a pregnancy test and be negative if the test isn't very sensitive, because you can see how low HCG levels are at that point. There was no reason to take a pregnancy test at that point, because someone has long known that they've been pregnant became pregnant months ago. But it's just a little quirk, right, that someone can actually test negative for pregnancy even though they're extremely far along, because of those low HCG levels at the final trimester of pregnancy.